The New Maid by Shirley Jackson. It was the first golden week of spring, and Miss Arthur William Morgan was almost completely unaffected by it. To begin with, she rarely saw the spring weather anyway, since she got on a commuter train every morning before the weather had righted itself for the day, and took the commuter train home again in the evening after everything the weather could do with itself in one day was over with, and spent the time in between in her fancy air-conditioned office designing clothes for fashionable women to wear the following autumn. On Saturdays and Sundays, Ms. Morgan frequently caught a passing glimpse of the weather between getting up, running off to somewhere to see someone, but spring weather is a thing to soak in, and it had no time to do any real affecting of Miss Morgan. Mr. Morgan, who habitually caught the commuter train 4 minutes later than his wife in the morning and 7 minutes earlier than his wife in the evening, could hardly have been expected to call his wife's attention to the soft air, the gentle sun, and the warm breeze. At any rate, it was this first really golden week of spring Miss Morgan had hired a new maid. Not actually hired, that is, and she wasn't really a maid if you stop to think about it. But Miss Arthur William Morgan was so indiscriminate about the persons in her employ, since they all merged in her mind eventually into one inferior character, that you might as well say Miss Morgan had hired a new maid and be done with it. The person had come to answer an advertisement in the local paper, wanted housekeeper and governess of twin children, 7 years old, good salary, best of references required, right for appointment. Out of all the letters, Miss Morgan had selected one neatly written in a fine old-fashioned hand on heavy, expensive paper. Anything expensive appealed to Miss Morgan. She had gone so far as to give up one of her precious Sunday afternoons to an interview, and perhaps in some subtle way the spring weather touched Miss Morgan that day, because the applicant was no sooner seen than hired. And Miss Morgan felt that she had made her usual good bargain. The applicant was a smiling, cheerful woman, perhaps a shade older than Miss Morgan expected, but she certainly seemed lively enough to keep up with the 7-year-old twins. And although it was not important, the twins liked her too. As Andy said to Anne that strange spring night when the lights were out and only the moonlight enabled them to see each other sitting up in their twin beds, "I like her because she smiles a lot." "I like her," said Anne, "because she has candy in her pocket." "Always thinking about candy and stuff," Andy said scornfully. "Anyway," she said, "she's always has candy in her pocket." "That's a good thing," said Anne. "I wish it was already tomorrow," she added wistfully. "I'm going to be tiny and live in a dollhouse all day." "I'd like to be a squirrel, I guess," Andy said. "Maybe a bear or a cowboy. Only that's way out west, and I guess I'd better stay around home for the first time. Maybe a tiger, or I guess a squirrel." "You could be a pig," Annie suggested, willfully, hopefully. "I wish it was tomorrow," she said. "We could do anything we like, and I'm going to be tiny and live in a dollhouse. Maybe you want to be a puppy." "Oh, Anne," Andy said. "Or a cow." Anne was getting sleepy. "Or a horse." "Oh, Anne." They began to giggle softly. "Or a cat." Old Anne. "Or a pig," Anne said, her voice muffled in a pillow. "Pig," she added, and was asleep. Andy, with his masculine superiority, outlasted her valiantly. He heard her take 2 deep breaths before his own eyes shut. "Squirrel," he said, and smiled in his sleep. Downstairs, Miss Arthur William Morgan said to her husband in that soft, persuasive voice wives use sometimes, "After all, I have my work too. Please let's not forget, dear, that my work is almost as important as yours." "Almost," she said again, and her voice, slipping away in silence, implied strongly that she was being wonderfully flattered to his work. "Aren't I ever going to hear anything but your work?" Mr. Arthur William Morgan looked at his wife irritably. "I'm tired of hearing about your work." "Not half as tired," Ms. Morgan said softly, stepping into the advantage, "as I am sometimes." "All right," her husband said. "So you've got a very important job and you're a very important woman and everyone thinks you're wonderful and no one, not even your husband, is allowed to think any different." "Except sometimes," he added bitterly. "I get to wishing I had a wife who wasn't quite so important, who stayed home, and sometimes—" "I suppose you wish you married someone else?" his wife asked, still using her same soft voice. "I suppose you wished you'd married—" Their argument, begun in a familiar strain, went on in channels already so smoothly worn by years of bickering that neither of them bothered any longer to think about what they were saying. Mr. Morgan remarked that other wives found it possible to stay home and care for their homes and children. Miss Morgan pointed out that other wives did not have important responsible positions. Ms. Morgan added that this statement is usual corollary, which was that other wives did not have weak-kneed husbands who couldn't take on half the responsibilities their wives did. Mr. Morgan retorted that he personally didn't see what was so damned important about Miss Morgan and her tiresome work, except that it seemed to make Miss Morgan feel she was right to tell everyone, Mr. Morgan in particular, what to do. Miss Morgan said that someone had to tell him. Mr. Morgan said that he was capable of taking care of himself. Miss Morgan said that she had never felt that subservience was necessary in a wife. Mr. Morgan said their voices went on and on. In the kitchen, the new maid, her pocket full of candy, her eyes twinkling wickedly at some secret knowledge, listening first to the voices of the children as they drifted down from the open window of the room. When there was silence upstairs, she was forced to listen to the monotony of the argument going on between Mr. and Mrs. Morgan. After she had put the last dish away, given a final polish to the sink, surveyed her new kitchen one last time to make sure that everything was in perfect order against the morning, the new maid smiled at the door behind which Mr. and Mrs. Morgan were bickering and went soundlessly upstairs to the room where the children slept in identical positions as befitted twins. They had both kicked their blankets off and she covered them. Andy said, "Ugh," inquiringly, and Anne answered him, "Meh." Then the new maid, who had that day, by Mrs. Morgan's authority, been given full charge of the children, the house, the cooking, the laundry, and presumably the mice in the pantry and the pumpkins in the garden, went soundlessly on her small feet to the room Miss Morgan had assigned her, and where she unpacked her belongings that afternoon. Much, much later, Mr. and Mrs. Morgan resolved their argument at some point of mutual weariness, at which it had been resolved so many times before, and went to bed. In the morning, the sun rose as usual and sent its usual impertinent rays to glitter on the eyelids of Miss Morgan. She opened her eyes, stirred uneasily, blinked, and sat up in bed. The room was full of sun. It was emphatically spring weather, and Mrs. Arthur William Morgan leaped out of bed with a firmness and resiliency she had not employed for a very long time. She slid expertly through the formality of washing, dressed quickly, not bothering with her shoelaces, gave her hair a civil pat with a brush, and ran downstairs. It's morning, she was thinking. The sun is bright. The sky is blue. I am hungry. She ran into the kitchen and said as she ran, "Can I please have a cookie?" "No cookie," said the new maid, looking severely at the plates she was setting on the kitchen table. "Not before breakfast." What's for breakfast?" said Mrs. Morgan. "Can I have mine now? Right away? Quick?" "You can have it when it's ready," said the new maid. "Not before." "But I'm hungry," said Miss Morgan. "I'm starving." The new maid half smiled. She set the bowl of hot oatmeal down at one place and beckoned with her head at Miss Morgan. "There you go," she said. Miss Morgan sat down, twisted her feet comfortably around the rungs of her chair, and said, "Oatmeal? Oatmeal again?" She slid her napkin out of the ring and onto the floor, bent to retrieve it, and dropped her spoon. "I hate oatmeal," she said, "and I want to put my own sugar on it." "You mind your manners," said the new maid, "or you won't have any sugar at all." Miss Morgan ate half her oatmeal in 3 spoonfuls, then lingered over the other half until it was clammy. She bit largely into a piece of toast and broke the rest of the toast into small pieces, some of which she dropped into her fruit juice glass. Some of them she hid inside her napkin ring. "Can I please be excused?" she finally asked. The new maid looked down at the dish of oatmeal, sighed, and said, 3 more spoonfuls and you can go run along." Miss Morgan dawdled over her 3 spoonfuls until she was excused without them, and then, free of the ritual of breakfast and possessed of a cookie, she ran out into the garden. She wandered for a while, just looking. The grass was unbelievably green, the flowers just beginning to show color in the bright spring morning. The sky was so blue it hurt Miss Morgan's eyes to look at it. When she looked up once, she saw a gray squirrel race happily up the trunk of the tallest tree in the garden. When he reached the high branch, he stopped, looking curiously around and down at Miss Morgan, and winked his eyes at her amiably. "Come on down, squirrel," Miss Morgan said. She held out her hands and called to him. Come on, come on." "I'll give you some peanuts," she added winningly. But the gray squirrel only winked mockingly at her and ran on, up the tree and out of sight. Miss Morgan went on, undiscouraged, through the garden. When she turned a corner of the path, she saw suddenly a small boy staring back at her. For a minute, they regarded each other soberly, and then the small boy said, "Who are you?" "Think you're big?" Miss Morgan stood on one foot, swung the other back and forth. "I'm bigger than you," she pointed out. "I'm better than you, too." "I'm smarter than you," the small boy said. "I'm smarter than you," Miss Morgan said. "And I can boss you if I want to." "You cannot," said the little boy. "Let's play house," suggested Miss Morgan. "I'll be the daddy and you be the mommy. And I must come home from the office and you must be cooking dinner. And I must say, I don't want to play house, said the little boy. I want to play army. How do you play army, Miss Morgan? Said Miss Morgan. First I kill you, then you kill me, said the little boy reasonably. I don't want to play that, Miss Morgan, said Miss Morgan. That's a silly, silly game. It is not, said the little boy. It is so, said Miss Morgan. She turned and ran away, through the garden and back into the kitchen. Can I have another cookie, she asked. After lunch, she was tired and ready for a rest. But the minute she was put into the room with the shades drawn and the door closed, she got out of bed, crept softly on her bare feet over to the dresser. There she opened all the jars, bottles of powder, creams, and perfumes. Most of them she rubbed on her face and into her hair. She carefully removed all of her clothes, then, as carefully, put them on again, but backwards. Then she wiggled under the bed and played there until the new maid came and said she could get up from her rest. And the new maid added, tightening her lips, Miss Morgan could just keep her clothes on backwards for the rest of the day. Later that afternoon, she played and danced among the flowers. Miss Morgan met the little boy again in the garden, and he yelled at her from the distance, "Nah, nah, you can't boss me." She chased him, but he escaped her and stood behind the bush and jeered at her as the squirrel capered above their heads in the late afternoon sunlight. Miss Morgan began to cry finally and ran away herself into another part of the garden. It occurred to her that she could go into the house and ask for another cookie, but she had just turned the corner to the front steps when the sun, which had been meditating on the scene unnoticed for quite a while, went down. Miss Morgan, her foot on the first of the steps, turned when she heard the sound behind her and saw her husband. "Evening, Agnes," he said formally. "Arthur," Miss Morgan replied as formally. Together in silence, they went up the steps to the front door. He held the door open for her, and they went inside. In the living room, the lamps were on, and Miss Morgan thought briefly how comfortable and warm it looked after the chill that had followed the sun's setting. Then Miss Morgan said, "Why, look at you. You've got everything on backwards." "Well, you've got mud all over yourself," she said angrily. After one more mutually disapproving glance, they turned on their backs on each other. "Dinner is served," said the new maid from the doorway. Mrs. Morgan sat down at the table, looked deeply into her bowl of consomme, and said, "Heavens, I'm tired." "So am I," said the husband, as though the fact surprised him. "What did you do all day?" asked Miss Morgan maliciously. "I mean, to get so tired." "More than you do," his voice rose in its familiar argumentative tone. "If you think," he began. "I think," Mrs. Morgan cut in smoothly, "that you are speaking to me as though I were one of your secretaries or some such thing. Remember," she pointed out icily, "you are not she stopped abruptly. "Well, you can't boss," he began. And then he too stopped speaking. His face went crimson, and Miss Morgan, her own face reddened, staring back at him. "You can't boss me," he finished weakly. His mouth stayed open as he stared at his wife. "You," Miss Morgan said hopelessly, "can't boss me." And then they both began to laugh, guiltily at first and unwilling to look at each other, but then finally holding on to each other weakly. While their tears rolled down their cheeks until they were no longer able to laugh out loud, but could only gasp. "Arthur," Miss Morgan said finally, barely able to speak. "Oh, Arthur." Miss Morgan wiped her eyes with the back of her hands. "And your clothes," he said. "Agnes, your clothes." Together they burst into laughter again. The new maid, peering through the swinging doors between the dining room and the kitchen, watched the couple for a quick minute, then grinning, returned to the dishwashing. From upstairs, the voices of the children drifted down to her through the open windows. And when you're right on top in the little tiny branches, Andy's voice rose, you can swing and hold on tight and swing way out over the ground. Anne giggled softly. I have 5 cookie crumbs and a grape, she said. You know, the little cups in the little tiny china closet, well, they leak. Everything leaks out of the bottoms of them. And the beds look soft, but really they're not. And the ground looks so far, far away, and went on dreamingly. And you have to hold on tight. And I rode on the little fire engine, Anne said. She wound it up for me, and I rode around and around the playroom. And it's miles and miles and miles, her voice faded. Swinging back and forth up in the sky, Andy said, his voice softened abruptly. Up in the sky, he said once more, and then all was quiet. The new maid finished her washing, took the untouched soup bowls off the table in the dining room, and glanced into the living room, where Mr. and Mrs. Morgan sat on the couch, holding hands, talking earnestly, still laughing occasionally. When the kitchen was clean and tidy, the new maid took off her apron, hung it up with a sigh. She went upstairs soundlessly, stopping at the room where Anne and Andy slept in identical positions. When she covered them, Anne said, "Grr," inquiringly, and Andy reassured her with, "Whoosh." Then the new maid went back upstairs, still without a sound on her small feet, to the room Miss Morgan had assigned her, and stopping now and then to smile wickedly to herself, began to pack.